I'm now going to ask Usman to carry on, and we await to see what he's doing now with some interest.
Hi, everybody. Let me switch on my mic here. So, how's that? Does that work? It's exactly the same. Okay. So I'll just stand over here then. I'm going to, so I've got the task of sort of giving you some polemics on data in a short space of time, which means I don't actually have to defend them. But I presume that that'll sort of happen in the discussion afterwards. What I'd like to do is actually look critically at this idea of data and then give you three examples of projects that I've been working on where I've been trying to sort of probe this aspect. So I'm the founder of something called patchbay.com, which was one of the first open data platforms for sensors and connected objects and connected environments and connected buildings. I launched it about now 7 years ago or so. And the idea was essentially to provide a framework through anyone who's working with this kind of time series data to store and share that data, to take out the sort of infrastructural problem, if you like, and make it possible to build stuff on top of that data. And so as a result of that, we now have data coming in from more than 120 countries. This should be real time, but I couldn't get the Wi-Fi network to connect to it. But this is if it were real time, imagine if it were real time. This is a visualization showing how much data is actually pouring into our system. We're dealing with about upwards of 50 million to 100 million data points per day. And it's coming from everything from energy monitors to weather stations, radiation sensors, air pollution monitors. There's even data coming from Second Life. There's data coming from buildings, from homes, from cars, from ships, really from almost anything that humans have created that's generating any kind of time series data. Now, often when people see this, I think they get a little excited and think about this whole idea of instrumenting the planet and how if we only had more data streams, we could know more about the world that we're constructing. And I think that this is based on the false premise that data is out there waiting to be captured. And it leads to basically this idea that what we need to do is measure more things because then we'll be able to make better decisions. So very often when talking about data, we end up talking about things like optimization and efficiency, and in some cases talking about the city, we talk about security and reducing friction and all these kinds of things. Now, this came from, I believe, it's actually part of the Enlightenment project, right? Which is that if you know your universe, you can control it, you can affect it, you can act upon it. And it has led to this paradigm, which is often repeated, that data somehow necessarily will lead to information which will result in some kind of knowledge and therefore wisdom. And very often data is kind of wrapped up into the whole idea of behavior change. If we just knew more about things, we'd be able to influence people's behavior, we'd be able to get them to do things. Never mind what better behavior actually is, which is its own contentious thing. There is this idea that somehow, simply by having more data, that we will necessarily have more efficient behavior. Now, the problem that I find with this is that it's a spectacularization of data, right? It's almost glorying in the data. And when you listen to these kinds of conversations, I hear almost exactly the same arguments for efficiency and what have you that we heard back in the 50s and 60s that gave rise to things like highways and high-rises. The Pruitt-Igoe high-rise, which resulted in a social catastrophe. The Robert Moses highways that sliced up communities and resulted in environmental catastrophe and resulted in actually extremely serious health effects on the people that actually lived in the cities. So this idea of actually just blanketly, as a blanket kind of imposing some kind of efficiency through data, I think is fundamentally flawed. I believe that data is actually crafted, it's created, right? It's not just out there waiting to be caught like butterflies in a butterfly net. Every action that we take is something to somehow create the data. And that's the part that actually interests me. So where we often end up talking about making data public, for me, the data is the least interesting thing. It's the making that's actually interesting and important to me. So I say, instead of making data public, I say, let's get the public making data. Because it's through the act of measuring that I think we actually genuinely get to some notion of understanding. It's not the data that leads to understanding. And I'm going to give you an example here. So in cities around the world, we have these air quality networks that are put out by local governments or by researchers. They're generally evenly spaced across the city. They're generally positioned at a height of about 3 to 5 meters off the ground, because the idea is that you want the measurement not to be in the kind of maxima where perhaps the pollutants are pooling towards the ground. And the idea or the outcome of these things is some kind of map or some kind of data set that gives some indication of the varying air quality across the city. There's a bunch of fundamental problems, I think, with this kind of process. First, for a human actually to be experiencing the same thing that those sensors are measuring, you'd actually have to be up in the trees. You'd actually have to be that high off the ground. And very few people are actually floating that high off the ground. The second thing is that actually where the pollutants are pooling in the maxima is probably where most citizens are most concerned about the air quality, where they're actually pushing their kids through the maxima and minima. And so these maps that are produced often, as I said, for research projects or for the local government, that give you some kind of indication that you're living in a neighborhood that has bad air quality. First of all, it's very unlikely that you have the sort of financial fluidity to just say, I'm going to move to an area where there's good air quality. Secondly, if you decided that you wanted to do something about improving that air quality, you have no way of doing enough on your own to influence what that measurement is in the neighborhood. So not only can you not act upon that data, because you have no effect on it, really, there's no kind of structuring of any kind of incentivization for improving what it is that's being measured. And I think that another aspect that's kind of interesting is actually quoted in Evgeny Morozov's new book, To Save Everything, Click Here, where he refers to the fact that there was research that showed that in an area where crime data was made open and available, it actually led to a drop in property prices in those areas where the crime data was higher. As a result of the drop in property prices, people stopped reporting crime. And so what you actually had was that this so-called, one would hope some kind of an objective data set that you could act upon, actually was not reflecting in any sense what was going on out there. So this is the map that we put together in a workshop at Haque in Barcelona, the Advanced Architecture Institute, where the students, a group of about 15, we actually went through the streets, wiping the buildings with a piece of paper or a napkin, and then measuring the grime on those buildings, basically the black carbon that had deposited there. And through that process, actually being able to look at, almost down to a meter resolution, what the varying, basically the pollutants that had deposited around the streets actually resulted in. Now, if I'd just produced this map, if we'd just given this map to the students and said, here is the data, here's the visualization of it, they would have no fundamental, real understanding of what was going on. It was only through that process of measuring that they began to understand really what the wind and the air quality, the qualities of air, if you like, rather than the air quality, around the buildings, around the intersections, around the corners, up and down, and being able to actually go through that measurement themselves, that gave them some idea and some ideas about how to design given that condition. Next project I want to talk about. So very often, there's this idea about conserving energy, and one thinks that simply by measuring energy, one's going to necessarily result in reducing energy. A lot of research has shown that, yes, when you put an energy monitor up somewhere, you can, temporarily at least, reduce the energy, but that assumes you wanted to reduce the energy in the first place, and therefore you kind of opted into this system automatically in order to reduce energy. In Natural Fuse, we basically created a plant with a power socket on it, and the idea is that this power socket is limited by the capacity of the plant to offset its carbon footprint. So if you use more energy, the idea is that the plant's growth, its kind of carbon sequestering, offsets the carbon footprint of what you plug into it. The problem is that even the energy expended by a low wattage lamp is more than can be offset by this single plant. It's actually 3 plants in the pot. It takes 6 units to offset the carbon footprint of a single low wattage LED lamp. So what we did is we actually networked these things up together. So over the internet they can communicate. When you switch on your lamp, it wakes up and it checks out into the community. Are there 5 other plants out there that are not currently being used? And so long as they are, you get as much energy as you want, and the community as a whole retains a neutral carbon footprint, or in some cases actually, is actually operating in credit. Now, in order to do this, you are necessarily saying, I'm okay being selfless. Because when I'm selfless, I say, give me as much energy as I need, except when it harms the carbon footprint of the community. And so if there are only 3 plants out there in the community, then it'll switch off your energy before you start to harm the carbon footprint. If you need to have energy, because you absolutely must have your light on, for example, you've heard an intruder coming into your residence, then you can switch it on to selfish mode and you'll get as much energy as you want. But if you end up harming the carbon footprint of the community, then it sends out a kill signal to kill somebody else's plant. It does this through vinegar. Now, in actual fact, we give each plant 3 lives before issuing that vinegar injection, and send out an email to the killer and the killee, basically saying, this happened, somebody was selfish, and therefore it resulted in this. And the point here is to build up a social interaction between people so that they're able to be selfish if they need to be, but they also understand that there is a social effect on this. So when you kill somebody else's plant, you are necessarily removing from the community's repository 1 unit of carbon sequestration. And so here it's the idea that maybe there's some data going on in the background, whatever, but it's really that public participation. It's the participation between people in terms of energy conservation that in some cases enables selfish behavior, and in some cases actually, selfish behavior is inevitable, but still enables the participants to retain a carbon neutral status. To finish off, I'm going to give an example of something I did just a few months ago, which is to say that actually it's the spectacularization is not necessarily the problem. I find spectacles quite useful for creating participation. I've forgotten to plug this in. Where do I plug it? This was something I did in Eindhoven. Do we have some audio? So this is out in a public square in Eindhoven. And the idea here was that people's voices gave form to these massive aurora floating above them. And so the way that they sang, or the way that they spoke, or the way that they clapped, or they chanted, or they yodeled in some cases, actually enabled them collectively to create this spectacle. But it was the spectacle that actually elicited the behavior from them, if you see what I mean. The behavior, the collaboration, and the attempts at being creative. And the way that creativity is elicited is by enabling them to basically to play with the system. So for possibly only 1 night, and in fact this was for 10 nights, they actually take ownership, if you like, and affect the public space in a way that perhaps they've never done before. They're actually in a sense, given permission to do things that you don't normally do in public space. So the spectacle is the thing that's actually, it is the material of participation here. So with that, I want to leave you with this idea that sense-making through data is necessarily a participative act. It's not simply about receiving data and thereby somehow understanding what it is that's necessary to do. And I mean that both from the sense of a human being sense-making as well as a machine sense-making, because how you craft the data, how you measure it, what you don't measure, is as important as whatever it is that's actually being measured, whatever the final data set. All of those things, anyone who's ever gone through the process of any kind of data collection will understand the massaging, actually, that you have to do on a data set in order for it to actually get some kind of coherence. You know, you remove outlier points because they were anomalies. You tweak the dynamic range so that it can kind of fit into your graph. If you're doing a visualization, very often people actually have in mind what the visualization should look like before they've actually input the data. And then they kind of tweak the variables. Everyone's done this, right? On a 2D little visualization, on an animation, even when you plug in the weather into your facade, what you're doing is tweaking the parameters to match what your expected or what your desired aesthetic output is like. And so I want to leave this idea with you that actually the important thing about data is the extent to which people are actually involved in collective sense-making through the measurement, not just through the data. Thanks a lot.